The day I finally chose my health over their control did not begin with courage or clarity. It began with hesitation, with a familiar weight pressing against my chest before I had even stepped out of the room. I remember standing still, keys in my hand, listening to the quiet of the house, and feeling that old instinct rise in me. The instinct to pause, to wait, to ask permission even when none was required. For most of my life, my needs had always come last, tucked neatly behind everyone else's expectations. That morning was no different at first. The difference was that my body had reached a limit my loyalty could no longer override. The appointment I was headed toward was not just another task on a calendar. It was a line I had drawn for myself after weeks of pain, fatigue, and fear I had tried to ignore. I had spent years convincing myself that discomfort was normal. That exhaustion was the price of being dependable. That postponing care was a reasonable sacrifice. Every ache had been reframed as something I could handle later. Later, I learned, was just another word for never. Choosing to go to the hospital that day felt unfamiliar, almost rebellious, because it centered me in a life where I had been trained to stay on the margins. When the demand came to cancel, it arrived exactly as it always had, abrupt and unquestioned, as though my time and body were resources to be allocated by someone else. The words themselves were not new. What changed was the way they landed. For the first time, I felt how deeply unreasonable it was to be expected to abandon my health without discussion or care. Saying no was not loud or dramatic. It was simple and quiet, but it carried the weight of years of restraint. That single word broke a pattern I had upheld since childhood, and the reaction that followed exposed how fragile that pattern truly was. The moment of violence that followed was shocking, but not entirely surprising. Control often reveals itself most clearly when it is challenged. What hurt more than the physical sting was the immediate dismissal that followed. The way my pain was treated as an inconvenience rather than a concern. In that instant, something in me shifted. I saw, with painful clarity, that my well-being had never been part of the equation. I was valuable only as long as I remained compliant. The realization was devastating, but it was also freeing. Walking out of that house was not an act of anger. It was an act of preservation. Each step toward the door felt heavy with history, with memories of all the times I had stayed quiet to keep peace that never protected me. Leaving meant accepting that choosing myself would cost me access to people who had mistaken obedience for love. It meant stepping into uncertainty without the familiar role of caretaker, fixer, or silent supporter. Yet, beneath the fear, there was a strange sense of relief. For once, I was listening to my body instead of silencing it. That day marked the beginning of a different relationship with myself, one where pain was not something to endure for the comfort of others, and health was not negotiable. I learned that prioritizing my well-being did not make me selfish or disloyal. It made me honest. Control thrives on guilt and obligation, but health demands attention, care, and respect. By choosing to honor my body, I broke free from a cycle that had defined me for decades. Looking back, I understand that the decision was never really about an appointment. It was about reclaiming ownership of my life. Choosing my health meant choosing truth over habit, survival over approval, and peace over performance. That day did not solve everything, but it gave me something I had never had before: the certainty that my life was worth protecting, even if I had to protect it alone. Growing up invisible in a family that only valued one child taught me lessons I never agreed to learn, but carried anyway. From an early age, I understood that attention was not something evenly distributed, but something earned through performance, charm, or usefulness. In our home, love was quiet when it came to me and loud when it came to my sister. The difference was never explained, only enforced through everyday moments that piled up until they felt permanent. I learned to watch more than I spoke, to notice what pleased and what disappointed, and to adjust myself accordingly. My sister existed at the center of the room, effortlessly drawing light toward her. Her achievements was celebrated, her mistakes softened, her needs anticipated before she ever voiced them. When she spoke, people listened. When she wanted something, The family reorganized itself to make space for her desires. I stood nearby, often tasked with supporting roles that went unnoticed. The quiet helper whose presence was assumed but rarely acknowledged. I was not unloved in obvious ways. Instead, I was overlooked in subtle ones, which somehow hurt more. There were no grand declarations that one child mattered more than the other. The favoritism lived in routines and expectations. I was the one reminded to be patient, to be understanding, to sacrifice for the greater good. Responsibility was placed on my shoulders early, framed as maturity rather than burden. When I succeeded, my accomplishments were met with brief nods or gentle reminders not to let them interfere with my sister's plans. Praise was rationed, and I learned not to expect it. Over time, I stopped offering pieces of myself that would only be ignored. Being invisible meant learning to minimize needs before they were even expressed. I became skilled at sensing tension, anticipating requests, and solving problems quietly. If something went wrong, I stepped in without being asked. If someone needed help, I provided it without complaint. This reliability was mistaken for strength, when in truth it was a survival mechanism. I believed that if I could just be useful enough, steady enough, undemanding enough, I might earn a place that felt secure. Instead, my invisibility deepened, reinforced by how easily my efforts blended into the background. What hurt most was not the lack of attention, but the way it shaped my understanding of worth. I began to measure myself by how little space I occupied, how few waves I caused. I learned that being seen could invite criticism or disappointment, so I chose safety in silence. My sister's confidence grew as mine quietly eroded, and the gap between us widened without either of us naming it. She learned to expect support. I learned to provide it, even at my own expense. As the years passed, invisibility followed me beyond childhood. It crept into my friendships, my work, and the way I cared for myself. I was accustomed to being the dependable one, the person others leaned on without asking how I was standing. Saying no felt unnatural, almost wrong, because my role had always been to accommodate. The family dynamic did not end when I left home. It lived on in habits and instincts I carried with me, long after the house itself was gone. Understanding this pattern took time and distance. I had to look back and recognize that what I experienced was not a failure of character, but a failure of balance. Being raised in the shadow of another taught me resilience, but it also taught me to disappear. Naming that truth was painful, yet necessary. Growing up invisible did not mean I lacked value. It meant I was never allowed to see it reflected back to me, and learning to see myself clearly became the work of my adulthood. The slow unlearning of a childhood spent being overlooked. When being, family, meant being used, the word itself slowly lost its warmth. It became something transactional, a label applied whenever someone needed time, labor, money, or silence. I grew up believing that loyalty was proven through endurance, that love required flexibility from me and firmness from everyone else. The idea that family should feel safe or mutual was never discussed. Instead, it was implied that my role was to give without question and to accept whatever was left in return. Requests rarely sounded like requests. They arrived as expectations wrapped in familiar language, reminding me of duty and obligation. I was told that family shows up, that family helps, that family does not keep score. What was never acknowledged was how one-sided that help became. My availability was assumed. My skills were taken for granted, and my time was treated as endlessly renewable. If I hesitated, even briefly, I was reminded of everything that had ever been done for me, as though gratitude should cancel out my autonomy. Being used did not always look cruel on the surface. Often it was disguised as closeness. I was included just enough to remain accessible, consulted only when something needed fixing. Conversations revolved around their needs, their problems, their plans. When I spoke about my own life, the attention faded quickly, redirected to something more urgent or more interesting. I learned to compress my stories, to edit my emotions, to make myself efficient even in conversation. My presence mattered only in terms of what it could provide. The most painful part was how easily my boundaries were dismissed. Saying no was treated as betrayal rather than honesty. Any attempt to prioritize myself was met with accusations of selfishness or ingratitude. I was made to feel that caring for my own well-being was a luxury I had not earned. Over time, I internalized this belief, questioning my right to rest, to refuse, to choose differently. Being used worked because I had been trained to doubt myself before doubting them. There was a particular kind of exhaustion that came from always being needed, but never truly considered. I was trusted with responsibilities, yet excluded from decisions. My reliability became a convenience that others depended on without acknowledging its cost. Each favor added another invisible thread, tying me back to expectations I had never agreed to. The word family was used to keep me in place, to remind me that my role was fixed and deviation would come with consequences. Realizing this truth was not sudden. It came in fragments, in moments when the imbalance became too clear to ignore. A careless comment, an unreturned favor, a demand made without regard for my circumstances. Slowly, I saw that what was framed as closeness was actually control, and what was called love was often entitlement. Family, in this context, was not about mutual care, but about access. Access to my time, my energy, my identity. Letting go of that version of family required redefining what the word meant to me. I had to accept that shared history does not guarantee shared respect. Love cannot exist where consent is absent, and sacrifice is expected from only one side. When being family meant being used, choosing distance became an act of self-respect rather than cruelty. Walking away did not erase the years of giving, but it reclaimed what remained of me. I learned that true family does not drain you dry and call it devotion. It does not demand your silence in exchange for belonging. Understanding this allowed me to release guilt that was never mine to carry. In doing so, I made space for relationships built on reciprocity, where being family finally meant being seen, valued, and free. The truth that exposed everything they stole from me did not arrive with shouting or confrontation. It surfaced quietly, through documents, timestamps, and undeniable evidence that left no room for denial. What had been taken was not only money or identity, but years of trust, autonomy, and the belief that sacrifice would eventually be returned as care. Seeing the truth laid out in black and white forced me to confront a betrayal that had been unfolding slowly, hidden behind familiarity and the assumption that family could never cross certain lines. For a long time, I had sensed something was wrong without being able to name it. There were moments when my resources seemed to disappear faster than they should have, when obligations multiplied without explanation, when I was told not to worry because everything was being handled. Trust had been used as a blindfold. I had been encouraged to stay passive, to believe that the systems tied to my name were being used responsibly. The truth dismantled that illusion in an instant. What hurt most was realizing how calculated it all was. Access had been granted under the guise of closeness, justified by years of conditioning that told me saying no would make me disloyal. They had taken advantage of my reliability, my silence, and my reluctance to question authority. The theft was not impulsive. It was methodical, built on the certainty that I would not look too closely, that I would accept explanations without resistance. In that realization, I saw how my compliance had been mistaken for consent. The exposure of the truth forced me to reckon with the emotional cost alongside the tangible losses. It was not just financial damage, but the erosion of my sense of self. They had taken my name and used it as a tool, turning my identity into a resource to be exploited. Each unauthorized decision made on my behalf reinforced the idea that my life was something others could manage, redirect, and benefit from without consequence. Recognizing this was devastating, yet it also clarified the depth of the violation. As the full scope of what had been taken came into focus, anger gave way to something colder and more resolute. The truth removed ambiguity, and with it, the guilt I had carried for years. I was no longer confused about where responsibility lay. The narrative I had been fed, that I was difficult, ungrateful, or overly sensitive, collapsed under the weight of facts. For the first time, my experience was validated not by emotion, but by evidence. Facing the truth meant acknowledging that what I had lost could never be fully recovered. Time, trust, and peace are not easily restored once broken. Yet the exposure also returned something invaluable. It gave me agency. By naming what had been stolen, I reclaimed ownership over my story and my future. Silence had protected them. Truth protected me. There was a strange sense of relief in no longer having to explain myself. The facts spoke clearly, without distortion or manipulation. I did not need their apologies or justifications. The truth had already severed the hold they once had over me. It revealed not only what they had taken, but how little they had ever intended to give. In the end, the truth did more than expose wrongdoing. It drew a line between who I had been and who I was becoming. It marked the moment I stopped questioning my right to be whole. What they stole was real, but what I gained in clarity and self-respect was greater. The truth did not heal everything, but it gave me the power to stop the loss and finally move forward on my own terms. Walking away with peace they could never take back was not a dramatic escape or a moment of triumph. It was quiet, deliberate, and deeply personal. There were no final arguments, no speeches meant to be remembered, no doors slammed in anger. What ended was not just a relationship, but a lifetime of waiting for understanding that was never going to come. Peace did not arrive as relief at first. It arrived as stillness, unfamiliar and unsettling, like stepping into silence after years of noise. For a long time, I believed that walking away meant losing something essential, as though distance would erase my history or invalidate my endurance. I feared that, without their approval, I would feel incomplete or unmoored. Instead, what I found was space. Space to breathe without anticipating criticism, to exist without explaining myself, to rest without earning it. Peace was not the absence of pain, but the absence of constant vigilance. I no longer had to scan every interaction for hidden expectations or unspoken debts. The hardest part of leaving was releasing the hope that things might one day change. Hope had kept me tied to patterns that drained me, convincing me that patience would eventually be rewarded. Letting go of that hope felt like grief. It required accepting that love, when it is conditional and controlled, is not something you can fix by trying harder. Walking away meant choosing reality over potential. And that choice, though painful, was honest. In the quiet that followed, I began to notice how much energy I had spent managing other people's emotions. Without that burden, I could finally hear my own thoughts clearly. Decisions became simpler. I slept more deeply. My body responded to the absence of stress in ways I had not expected. Peace showed itself in small moments, in mornings without dread, in evenings without rehearsed explanations, in the freedom to change my mind without fear of backlash. They tried, in subtle ways, to reclaim their influence. Messages went unanswered. Familiar guilt was offered like an invitation. But peace had taught me something crucial. Distance is not cruelty. It is protection. Each time I chose not to engage, the boundary strengthened. What they could no longer take was my attention, my compliance, my willingness to be diminished for the sake of harmony. Peace was not something they could negotiate away. Walking away also meant redefining who I was without opposition. For so long, my identity had been shaped by resistance, by what I endured and what I tolerated. In the absence of conflict, I discovered parts of myself that had been buried under survival. Creativity returned. Curiosity resurfaced. I began to build a life that did not require justification. This version of peace was active, not passive. It asked me to choose myself again and again, even when old instincts urged retreat. What surprised me most was that peace did not feel lonely. It felt spacious. The quiet allowed room for healthier connections, for relationships grounded in mutual respect rather than obligation. I learned that peace is not something granted by others. It is something claimed through consistent self-respect. Once claimed, it becomes fiercely protective, resistant to manipulation and guilt. Walking away did not erase the past, but it changed my relationship to it. The memories lost their power to wound. They became markers of how far I had come rather than chains pulling me back. The peace I carried with me was not fragile.